A 10-year-old girl walks into a room full of outlaws and says 5 words that change everything. Someone's following us. She's shaking so hard her backpack rattles against her spine. Outside, the Wyoming wind screams through a parking lot full of Harleys, and somewhere in the frozen dark, a black sedan idles with its headlights off. The police already told her mother to stop calling. Child Protective Services closed the file. The school counselor said she was imagining things. Nobody believed her. Nobody. Until a club president with 3 combat tours and a face full of scars looked into her eyes and saw something he recognized. Real fear. The kind that doesn't lie. What happens next will test every bond this brotherhood has ever built. Stay with me until the very end of this one. I promise you, it's worth it. If you're watching, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from, and let's ride. The clubhouse smelled like motor oil and yesterday's coffee. It always did. Didn't matter what season, didn't matter who'd cleaned last. That smell had soaked into the walls of the Iron Raven's headquarters like a permanent scar, the way certain memories sink into bone and refuse to leave. 2 space heaters rattled in opposite corners of the main room, pushing warm air against the December cold that crept through every crack in the converted warehouse on the edge of Ridgemont, Wyoming. A town small enough that everybody recognized your truck, but large enough that nobody actually knew you. Cade Mercer sat at the bar with a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His hands were wrapped around the mug like he was trying to absorb its heat through his knuckles, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2 Purple Hearts collecting dust in a shoebox under his bed. A marriage that ended the same week he got his discharge papers. He was 44 years old and president of a motorcycle club that most of Ridgemont pretended didn't exist, which suited him fine. He'd spent enough of his life being visible, being a target. Now he preferred the margins. The places where nobody pointed and nobody saluted and nobody asked him to explain why he still woke up at 3 a.m. with his fists clenched around sheets soaked in sweat. Boone Keller was across the room, stretched out on the old leather couch with a motorcycle parts catalog open on his chest, not reading it. Boone was 51, built like a refrigerator someone had wrapped in denim and tattoos, and he hadn't spoken more than 6 consecutive words all day. That was normal. Boone communicated mostly through nods, grunts, and the occasional raised eyebrow that carried more weight than most people's entire vocabularies. He'd served with Cade in Kandahar. They'd carried the same coffins, breathed the same dust. Neither of them talked about it, which was precisely why they understood each other better than anyone else on the planet. 4 other brothers were scattered through the clubhouse, playing pool, checking phones, killing the kind of dead Saturday afternoon that December always brought to a town where winter meant isolation, and isolation meant silence, and silence meant the things you tried not to think about got louder. The television above the bar was tuned to a college football game nobody was watching. The volume was low enough to be ignorable, high enough to fill the emptiness. Then the door opened. Not the way a grown man opens a door, shouldering through it, stamping boots, announcing himself. This was different. This was a small hand pulling at a heavy steel handle, a gust of frozen wind cutting through the room like a blade, and a figure so small she barely cleared the bottom hinge, stepping inside with snowflakes melting in her dark hair. Lena Ashcroft was 10 years old and weighed maybe 65 pounds with her winter coat on. Her backpack, purple, faded, one strap held together with duct tape, hung from both shoulders like she'd been wearing it for days. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but the rest of her face was white, paper white, the kind of pale that comes from something deeper than temperature. She stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, scanning the room with eyes that were too old for her face. Then she said it. "Someone's following us." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It came out flat and steady, the way a person speaks when they've already decided that the world is dangerous, and the only question left is whether anybody in it will help. Every man in the room stopped moving. Cade set his coffee down. The ceramic clicked against the bar top, and the sound was enormous in the sudden quiet. He didn't stand up, didn't need to. He just turned on his stool and looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The space heaters rattled. The wind pushed against the walls. Somewhere outside, a Harley's exhaust pipe ticked as it cooled in the parking lot. "Following who?" Cade said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Me and my mom." Where's your mom now? Home. She doesn't know I came here. Boone swung his legs off the couch. The catalog slid to the floor. He didn't pick it up. He was watching the girl with the kind of focus he usually reserved for incoming threats, and that alone told Cade everything he needed to know about how seriously to take this. Come sit down, Cade said. He didn't soften his voice, didn't use the sing-song tone that adults deploy when they think children are fragile. He spoke to her the way he'd speak to anyone walking through that door asking for help, direct, level, without performance. Lena seemed to recognize this. She crossed the room and climbed onto the stool next to him with the practiced caution of someone who'd learned that chairs could be pulled out from under you. Tell me what you saw. She told him. A dark sedan, blue or black, she wasn't sure. It was always dusk or dark when she noticed it. Parked across from their apartment on Birchwood Lane 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Engine running, no headlights. The first time, she thought it was someone waiting for a friend. The second time, she told her mother. The third time, 2 nights ago, the car was there when she fell asleep, and still there when she woke up at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom and looked out the window because she couldn't help it. My mom called the cops, Lena said. They came and drove around the block and said they didn't see anything. Then they told her she should make sure I wasn't watching too many scary movies. Cade's jaw tightened. 1 millimeter, that was all. But Boone saw it from across the room. She called them twice more after that, Lena continued. The second time they didn't even send a car, just told her to call back if something actually happened. If something actually happened. Cade turned those words over in his mind like a grenade pin. The entire philosophy of every institution he'd ever trusted, military, police, government, compressed into one casual dismissal. We'll help you after you're already hurt. We'll investigate once there's a body. We'll take it seriously when it's too late to matter. Why'd you come here? Cade asked. Lena looked at him. Because I walk past this place on the way to school, and I see you guys outside sometimes, and nobody messes with you. Boone made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something else. She's not wrong, Boone said. Cade studied the girl's face for another moment. He was looking for the things he'd been trained to identify. The micro-expressions of exaggeration, the shifting eyes of a child seeking attention, the rehearsed quality of a story designed to impress. He found none of it. What he found instead was exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of someone who has asked for help from every direction and been denied so many times that walking into a biker clubhouse seemed like a reasonable option. He believed her. Not because of evidence, not because of logic, because he recognized the look in her eyes. He'd worn it himself years ago in a VA hospital waiting room where a clerk told him his paperwork was incomplete and he'd need to come back in 6 to 8 weeks. Boone, he said. Boone was already standing. Get Nolan, get Dutch. Tell them I need eyes on Birchwood Lane tonight. Lena blinked. You believe me? Yeah. Just like that? Just like that. She stared at him for a long time, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest possibility that trust might still exist somewhere in a world that had spent 10 years teaching her otherwise. Tessa Ashcroft opened her apartment door 40 minutes later to find Cade Mercer standing on her porch with her daughter beside him, and 2 motorcycles idling at the curb behind them. The look on her face cycled through approximately 7 emotions in 3 seconds. Shock, anger, fear, confusion, more anger, a flicker of something that might have been relief, and then a hard mask of protective hostility that Cade recognized immediately because he wore one just like it. Lena Marie Ashcroft, get inside right now. Mom, now. Lena went. Tessa turned to Cade with the kind of fury that only a single mother running on 4 hours of sleep and 11 months of fear can generate. She was 32, thin in a way that suggested meals skipped for someone else's sake, and her eyes had the same premature age that her daughters carried. She was wearing a waitress uniform from Patty's Diner on Route 9, and her hands smelled like coffee grounds and fryer grease. Who the hell are you, and why is my daughter with you? My name's Cade. She came to our clubhouse, the Iron Ravens, down on, I know what the Iron Ravens are. Everybody knows what the Iron Ravens are. And my 10-year-old daughter has no business anywhere near. She came to us because nobody else would listen. That stopped her. The anger didn't leave her face, but it rearranged itself, making room for something raw underneath. She gripped the door frame with one hand, and Cade noticed her knuckles were chapped and cracked from winter and work, and probably from wringing her hands at 2 in the morning while a dark sedan sat across the street. The police said, "I know what the police said." Silence. Wind cut down Birchwood Lane, carrying the smell of wood smoke and frozen earth. One of the Harleys at the curb rumbled low, its exhaust breathing white clouds into the dark. "We're going to put some guys on your block tonight," Cade said. "They won't bother you. You won't even know they're there unless you need to." Tessa searched his face. She was looking for the catch, the angle, the price. Because in her experience, Cade could read it in every line around her eyes, nothing came without a price. Help didn't exist without strings. Kindness was a down payment on obligation. "Why?" she said. Cade almost smiled, almost. "Because she walked into a room full of strangers and asked for help. That's either the bravest thing I've seen this year or the most desperate. Either way, it deserves a response." He turned and walked back to his bike. Tessa stood in the doorway watching him go, one hand still gripping the frame, the cold air streaming past her into the apartment, where Lena was probably pressed against the window, watching everything. That night, Nolan Pierce and Dutch Ballard sat in a borrowed pickup truck on the corner of Birchwood and Elm with the engine off and the heater broken. Nolan was 36, lean, quiet in a way that made other people uncomfortable, and currently navigating the wreckage of a relationship that had ended 3 weeks ago when his girlfriend told him she'd been seeing someone else for 5 months and moved to Colorado the next day. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since. He'd been driving aimlessly through Ridgemont after midnight most nights, not going anywhere, just moving, because movement felt less like drowning than sitting still. Dutch was the opposite. Loud when he needed to be, steady when it counted, built like a former high school linebacker who'd traded the field for a welding torch and a Sportster. He had a thermos of coffee and a bag of gas station jerky and the patience of a man who'd once spent 14 hours lying in a hunting blind waiting for an elk that never showed up. They watched the street. Nothing moved. Birchwood Lane was a row of small houses and smaller apartments, porches with sagging steps, cars with rust along the wheel wells. A neighborhood that had been middle class 20 years ago and had been sliding slowly downhill ever since, losing residents to the same economic gravity that pulled small-town America apart piece by piece. Streetlights cast yellow pools on the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere. A television flickered blue through a curtain window. At 11:40, Nolan's phone buzzed. A text from Cade. "Anything?" "Nothing," Nolan typed back. "Stay till 3. I'll send relief. Copy." They stayed till 3. They came back the next night, and the night after that. And on none of those nights did a dark sedan appear on Birchwood Lane, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it was terrifying. Because a stalker who stops when bikers show up is a stalker who's watching closely enough to know that bikers showed up, and that meant whoever was in that sedan was patient, observant, and smart enough to wait. Cade sat in the clubhouse on Tuesday morning with his coffee going cold again and turned this over in his mind. The club's informal meeting had drawn 8 members, all seated around the scarred wooden table that served as their war room, their council chamber, their kitchen island. Smoke curled from an ashtray. Boots rested on chair rungs. The overhead light swung gently from a draft nobody could locate. "So we're babysitting a neighborhood now," said Reno Vasquez, the club's sergeant-at-arms, from the far end of the table. Reno was 40, sharp-featured and chronically skeptical. He loved the club. He also loved reminding everyone when a mission was becoming a liability. "We got businesses to run. We got our own problems." "A kid asked for help," Boone said. "Kids ask for a lot of things." This kid walked half a mile in the snow to a building full of strangers because every adult in her life failed her. That's not asking for things. That's survival. Reno leaned back. He didn't argue. He never pushed back against Boone directly. Not because he was afraid of him, but because Boone had a way of making the simple truth sound like a closing argument. "The sedan hasn't come back," Dutch reported. 3 nights? Nothing. "Which means he knows we're there," Cade said. The room absorbed that. 8 men sitting with the knowledge that somewhere in Ridgemont, someone was adjusting their behavior based on the club's movements. It was a chess game. and they were playing without seeing the board. Could be nothing, Reno offered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. Could be, Kate agreed, but I've seen enough nothing that turned into something to know the difference doesn't matter until it's too late. It was Nolan who raised the other issue, and he did it quietly, the way he did everything. So quietly that it almost got lost under the sound of Reno tapping his lighter against the table. Some of the neighbors have been asking questions about me. Silence. What kind of questions? Cade said. Nolan stared at his hands. His knuckles were scarred from a bar fight 2 years ago, and his fingernails were black with engine grease. Why I'm driving around the neighborhood at night, why I'm always alone, why I sit in parked trucks on residential streets at 2 in the morning. He paused. A woman on Elm Street told Tessa she saw me driving past her house 3 nights in a row, before we started the watch. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not with accusations or raised voices, but something changed in the air, a subtle rearrangement of attention, like a compass needle finding a new north. Because Nolan had been driving around Ridgemont at night. Before Lena came to the clubhouse, before anyone knew about the sedan. He'd been out there in the dark, alone, sleepless, circling the same blocks over and over because motion was the only thing keeping the grief from eating him alive. And from the outside, from the perspective of a frightened neighborhood watching for threats, a lone man driving slowly through residential streets in the middle of the night looked exactly like what they were afraid of. Nobody said it, but Cade could feel the thought forming around the table like frost on a windshield. He could see it in the way Dutch's eyes moved, in the way Reno's lighter stopped tapping. I wasn't, Nolan started. Nobody's saying you were, Cade cut in, hard, final, the voice he used when a conversation needed to end before it became something worse. We know who you are, Nolan. We know what you've been going through. But the neighborhood doesn't, Reno said quietly. And there it was, the fracture. Invisible hairline, running through the center of everything the Iron Ravens had built together. Not a crack in loyalty, not yet, but a crack in certainty. And certainty, Cade knew, was the only thing holding a brotherhood together when the world outside was trying to tear it apart. He looked around the table. 8 faces. Some avoided his eyes. Some held them. All of them were calculating, weighing, measuring the distance between what they believed about their brother and what the evidence suggested to anyone who didn't know him. We find the sedan, Cade said. We find who's inside it. That's the mission. Everything else is noise. Heads nodded. But the nods were slower than they should have been. After the meeting, Nolan stood alone in the parking lot, his breath steaming in the cold, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his leather jacket. The zipper was broken, and the lining was worn thin, and the whole thing smelled like exhaust and loneliness. He lit a cigarette and smoked it down to the filter without tasting it. He knew what they were thinking, not because anyone had said it, but because he'd spent 36 years learning to read the spaces between words, the weight of a glance held half a second too long, the particular quality of silence that follows a question nobody wants to ask. They were wondering, and the worst part, the part that sat in his chest like a stone, was that he couldn't blame them. Because if he were on the outside looking in, he'd wonder too. A man driving alone through dark neighborhoods at night, every night, with no explanation he could give that didn't sound like an excuse. I was just driving. I couldn't sleep. I wasn't going anywhere. How many people with something to hide had said exactly those words? His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. 4 words. No signature, no context. I know it's you. Nolan stared at the screen. The cigarette burned down between his fingers, the ash falling silently to the frozen asphalt. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of a train horn and the faint metallic tang of coming snow. He looked up from his phone and scanned the empty parking lot, the dark tree line beyond, the road leading back into Ridgemont where every streetlight now felt like an eye. Someone wasn't just watching the neighborhood. Someone was watching him. Nolan didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed in the 1-bedroom apartment above Grady's Auto Supply on 3rd Street, staring at his phone like it was a loaded weapon someone had placed in his hand without instructions. The screen had gone dark 20 minutes ago, but the words still burned behind his eyes, 4 of them, arranged in the exact sequence designed to destroy a man who was already halfway gone. "I know it's you." He'd scrolled through every contact he had, checked every messaging app, run the number through 2 different search sites on his laptop, both of which returned nothing. A burner phone, a disposable number. Someone who wanted to say exactly 4 words and then vanish. The apartment was cold. The baseboard heater clicked and groaned, but produced a warmth so thin it evaporated before it reached the center of the room. Nolan sat in his boxers and a faded Henley with his leather jacket draped over his shoulders, like a blanket that smelled like everything he'd lost. Rides with Sarah, late-night gas station stops, the particular combination of her shampoo and highway air that had lived in the collar for months after she left, and was finally, mercifully fading. He thought about calling Cade, picked up the phone 3 times, put it down 3 times, because telling Cade about the text meant showing Cade the text, and showing Cade the text meant watching Cade's face as he read it, and Nolan wasn't sure he could survive the half-second delay between reading and reaction. That fraction of a moment where even a man like Cade would wonder. At 4 in the morning, he made coffee in a pot that hadn't been cleaned in a week. The coffee tasted like rust and regret. He drank 2 cups standing at the window, watching 3rd Street, watching nothing, watching the dark. By 6, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and gray and faintly yellow along the horizon, where the sun was trying and failing to break through the December overcast. Nolan pulled on jeans, boots, his jacket. He rode to the clubhouse in air so cold it felt like breathing glass. He didn't show anyone the text. Cade was already there. Cade was always already there. The man seemed to exist in the clubhouse the way certain pieces of furniture exist in a room, permanently, fundamentally, as though removing him would cause the entire structure to collapse. He was standing at the window behind the bar, holding his coffee with both hands, watching the parking lot with the same quiet vigilance he'd carried home from Kandahar and never set down. "You look like hell," Cade said without turning around. "Didn't sleep." "You haven't slept in 3 weeks." Nolan poured himself a cup from the pot Cade had already made. It was better than his. Everything at the clubhouse was better than what he had at home, which was part of the problem. The club was becoming his home, and a man who has nowhere else to go is a man who can be broken by the threat of exile. "Anything from the neighborhood last night?" Nolan asked. "Dutch did a sweep at midnight. Nothing." "So the sedan's gone." "The sedan's waiting." Nolan leaned against the counter. The kitchen was narrow, cluttered with mismatched mugs and a toaster that hadn't worked since September, and a calendar on the wall still turned to October because nobody cared enough to flip it. He could feel Cade watching him now, not at the window anymore, but turned halfway, studying him with those pale gray eyes that missed nothing and forgave everything but lies. "Something you want to tell me?" Cade said. "No." The word came out too fast. Nolan heard it and knew Cade heard it and knew that the speed of a denial was its own kind of confession. Cade held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, once, and turned back to the window. That nod was worse than any accusation. It meant, "I know you're holding something back, and I'm choosing to let you hold it, and the weight of that choice is now yours to carry." Nolan carried it, all day. Through a club ride out to the storage yard to check on inventory. Through lunch at the counter of Patty's Diner, where Tessa Ashcroft served him a turkey sandwich with hands that trembled slightly when she set down the plate. Through an afternoon of silence so thick it had texture. The kind of silence that grows between men who are thinking the same thought and refusing to speak it. The neighborhood was talking. Nolan knew it the way you know weather is coming. Not because anyone tells you, but because the air changes. Conversation stopped when he walked into the diner. Eyes followed him and then looked away too quickly. A woman he'd never met crossed the street when she saw him approaching on the sidewalk, and the gesture was so small, so instinctive, so unmistakably fearful that it hit him like a fist to the sternum. He was becoming the suspect, not to the club, not yet. The Iron Ravens operated on proof, on evidence, on the fundamental principle that a brother is innocent until the brotherhood determines otherwise. But the neighborhood didn't follow those rules. The neighborhood operated on feeling, on appearance, on the ancient human algorithm that converts proximity into guilt. A lone man. Driving at night. No family, no visible job. Leather jacket, motorcycle. The math was simple and devastating and wrong, and Nolan could see it hardening around him like concrete. a narrative setting into place that would be nearly impossible to break once it cured. At 4 o'clock, Reno found him in the garage behind the clubhouse, pretending to adjust the chain tension on his Dyna. Reno leaned against the door frame and lit a cigarette and watched him work with an expression that could have been sympathy or suspicion or some alchemical combination of both. "I need to ask you something," Reno said. "Then ask. Those drives you were taking, before all this started, where exactly were you going?" Nolan's wrench stopped moving. He didn't look up. He could feel the grease on his fingers, the cold metal against his palm, the particular weight of a question that arrives disguised as casual, but is anything but. "Nowhere." "Nowhere isn't a place, Nolan." "It is when you've got nothing left." Reno smoked. The garage smelled like oil and cold concrete and the faint sweetness of tobacco. A gust of wind rattled the corrugated metal door. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Reno said, "but I need you to understand what this looks like. A woman on Elm told her husband. Her husband told 2 guys at the hardware store. Those guys told their wives. By tomorrow, half of Ridgemont is going to think the guy stalking Birchwood Lane is one of ours. Let them think what they want. It's not about what they think. It's about what it does to the club. We're out there trying to protect these people. If they think the threat is coming from inside our cut, we lose everything. Credibility, access. The ability to do what Cade's trying to do." Nolan set the wrench down. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting the cold. He was eye level with Reno now, and the distance between them felt like a canyon. "You want me to stop writing at night. I want you to give me something I can work with, a route, a time frame, something that doesn't sound like a man with no alibi. I don't owe anyone an alibi. You owe the club the truth." There it was, the line that divided everything. Not an accusation, Reno was too smart for that, but a pressure. A lever applied to the exact point where loyalty meets suspicion, where brotherhood meets self-preservation, where the bond between men who've chosen each other as family meets the terrible arithmetic of doubt. Nolan stared at him. He thought about the text on his phone. "I know it's you." 4 words from a stranger that were doing more damage than a bullet, because a bullet at least has a direction, an origin, a trajectory you can trace. These words came from everywhere and nowhere, and they were reshaping reality around him. "I'll talk to Cade," Nolan said. "You should have already talked to Cade." Reno flicked his cigarette into the gravel and walked away. His boots made sounds like small detonations against the frozen ground. That evening, Cade called a second meeting. Not at the table, at the bar, which was less formal, more conversational, and therefore more dangerous because it blurred the line between official club business and personal confrontation. 7 members. No prospects. The door to the parking lot was closed against the wind, and the room smelled like leather and whiskey, and the particular electric tension that precedes a storm. Cade stood behind the bar. He didn't pour himself anything. That was a signal. When Cade drank during a meeting, things were normal. When Cade didn't drink, things were about to get real. "I've got 2 problems," he said. "The first is that whoever's been stalking Birchwood Lane is smart enough to go dark when we show up. The second is that half the neighborhood now thinks the stalker is one of us." Nobody looked at Nolan, which meant everybody was thinking about Nolan. "I'm not going to ask Nolan to defend himself," Cade continued, "because in this club, a man doesn't have to prove he's innocent. The burden goes the other direction. But I'm going to say this." He paused. The overhead light caught the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Shrapnel from an IED in Helmand Province that had killed 2 men on either side of him and left him with a face that looked like a roadmap of suffering. "If any of you have doubts, say them now, in this room, to his face, because I will not have this club eaten alive by whispers." Silence. Boots shifted on the floor. Someone coughed. The refrigerator behind the bar hummed its low, monotonous note. "Nolan," Boone said. Everyone turned. Boone was standing by the pool table, arms crossed, his enormous frame blocking the overhead lamp so that his face was half in shadow. He looked at Nolan with an expression that contained no judgment, no suspicion, no warmth, just the flat, unreadable calm of a man who has spent his life in situations where the wrong word gets people killed. Were you on Birchwood before or after the girl came to us? Before and after, Nolan said. Before, because I was driving everywhere. I didn't have a destination. I wasn't watching anyone. I wasn't parked. I was just moving. And after? After, because Kate asked me to be there. Can anyone confirm where you were on the nights the sedan was reported? No, I was alone. That's the whole point. I was alone because... He stopped, swallowed. The next words were going to cost him something. Because Sarah left, and the apartment feels like a coffin, and if I sit still long enough, I start thinking about things I don't want to think about. So I drive. That's it. That's the whole story. It's pathetic, and it's sad, and it's not criminal. The room held its breath. Cade watched Nolan's face the way a demolition expert watches a detonator, looking for the signs, the tells, the tiny indicators that determine whether something is live or inert. What he saw was pain, genuine, unperformable, bone-level pain. The kind that couldn't be faked because faking it would require experiencing it first. That's enough, Cade said quietly. Reno opened his mouth. Cade's eyes moved to him like a gun turret, and Reno's mouth closed. I said that's enough. A phone buzzed. Dutch pulled his out, glanced at the screen, and his face changed. The shift was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips. But in a room full of men trained to read danger, it was as loud as a gunshot. What? Cade said. Dutch turned the phone around. A text from a number none of them recognized. Wrong house. Wrong street. Wrong biker. The room went cold. Not metaphorically. Nolan could feel the temperature change, could feel the blood draining from his own face, could feel the collective weight of 7 men processing the same terrible realization simultaneously. Someone was watching them. Not just the neighborhood. Not just Nolan. The club. Someone knew about the surveillance. Someone knew which biker was on which street. Someone was close enough to monitor their movements and composed enough to taunt them about it. Cade took Dutch's phone. He read the message twice. His face didn't change. His hands didn't shake. But when he set the phone down on the bar, he set it down gently, the way you set down something explosive. Same type of message, Nolan said. His voice was barely audible. I got one last night. Every head in the room turned to him. What did it say? Cade asked. Nolan pulled out his phone, handed it over, watched Cade's eyes move across the 4 words, and then lift to meet his. Why didn't you show me this? Because I knew what it would look like. Cade stared at him. The scar on his face seemed deeper in the harsh light, a canyon of old violence cutting across features that had seen too much and forgiven too little, starting with himself. He set Nolan's phone next to Dutch's on the bar. 2 phones, 2 messages, 2 threads of the same web. Someone's running us, Boone said from the pool table. His voice was low, steady, and carried the particular gravity of a man stating a tactical reality. The texts, the sedan disappearing when we show up, the rumors in the neighborhood. This isn't a stalker who got lucky. This is someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Someone local, Cade said. Has to be. They know the streets. They know the routines. They know which brother is on which corner. Or someone's feeding them information, Reno said, and the implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to admit was burning. Cade's phone rang. Not a text. A call. He glanced at the screen. Tessa Ashcroft. He answered, listened, said nothing for 30 seconds. Then his jaw set in a way that Nolan had only seen twice, once in a combat briefing and once at a funeral. Stay inside, Cade said into the phone. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone. We're on our way. He hung up. Someone left flowers on Lena's windowsill, he said while she was inside the apartment, while Tessa was in the next room. A bouquet on the outside ledge of a second-floor window. The room didn't explode. It compressed. Like a coiled spring. Like a breath held too long. Like the moment before a detonation when everything goes perfectly, terribly still. Second floor, Dutch repeated. Second floor. Which meant a ladder. Which meant planning. Which meant someone had stood in the alley behind Tessa's building. In the dark, in the cold, had climbed to a child's bedroom window and placed flowers on the ledge with the calm precision of someone who wanted to send a message. Not a threat. Something worse. I can reach her whenever I want. Cade grabbed his jacket off the back of the stool. The leather creaked. His keys were already in his hand. He moved toward the door with the focused economy of a man transitioning from discussion to action, and every brother in the room moved with him. Not because he ordered it, but because the geometry of the situation had shifted from investigation to protection, and protection was the one thing none of them needed to be told to do. Nolan reached for his jacket. Cade stopped, turned, and in that moment, that fraction of a second between motion and stillness, Nolan saw something in Cade's eyes that cut deeper than any accusation. Hesitation. It lasted less than a heartbeat. Then it was gone, replaced by the same steady command that had held this club together through bar fights and bankruptcy and the kind of personal destruction that follows men home from war. But it had been there. A flicker. A shadow. The momentary calculation of a leader weighing risk against loyalty and finding them, for the first time, approximately equal. Everybody rides, Cade said. Everybody included Nolan. The word wasn't spoken directly to him, but it encompassed him, which was simultaneously a relief and a devastation, because being included by default is not the same as being included by choice, and Nolan could feel the difference the way a patient feels a surgeon's hesitation before the first cut. They rode to Birchwood Lane in formation. 8 Harleys cutting through the December night like a convoy of controlled thunder. The neighborhood heard them coming. Curtains moved, porch lights clicked on. A dog started howling 3 blocks away. They parked in a line along the curb, and the sight of 8 motorcycles outside a small apartment building at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night was either the most reassuring or the most terrifying thing those streets had ever seen, depending on which side of fear you stood. Cade took the alley first, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on nothing but readiness. Boone followed. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and recycling bins, and the detritus of lives lived too close together. The cold was sharp enough to burn. He found the ladder. An aluminum extension ladder leaning against the building's brick wall, positioned directly below Lena's window. It didn't belong to the building. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors they checked with over the next 20 minutes. It had been brought there, used, and left behind, either carelessly or deliberately, and Cade was betting on deliberately, because everything about this person screamed control. Tessa met them at the apartment door. Her face was gray. Lena was behind her, sitting on the couch with her backpack in her lap. The same faded purple backpack she'd carried into the clubhouse 5 days ago, held against her chest like a shield. "I want to leave," Tessa said. Her voice was flat, emptied. "I want to take her and go." "Where?" Cade asked. "I don't know, anywhere. My sister's in Cheyenne. I cannot. If he's watching this closely, he'll follow you. New city, no club, no one watching your block. You'd be more exposed, not less." Tessa's eyes filled. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together until they turned white, and she swallowed twice, and she held herself together with the kind of physical willpower that single mothers develop the way soldiers develop calluses, through repeated, sustained, unrelenting contact with pain. "Then what do I do?" Cade looked at Boone. Boone looked at Cade. A conversation happened between them that required no words and lasted approximately 2 seconds. "You move into the clubhouse," Cade said. "Both of you. Tonight. We'll pack what you need. The apartment stays empty. And then? And then we use it." Tessa stared at him. Behind her, Lena looked up from her backpack. The girl's eyes moved between Cade and her mother with the preternatural awareness of a child who has learned to read adult faces the way other children read picture books. "You want to use our home as bait," Tessa said. Cade didn't flinch, didn't dress it up, didn't soften it. "Yes." Tessa's hand found the doorframe again. That same gesture from their first meeting, gripping the wood like an anchor in a current that was pulling her somewhere she didn't want to go. "What if he doesn't come back?" "He'll come back. The flowers weren't a goodbye. They were a promise." Tessa looked at her daughter. Lena looked at Cade. And in the circuit of those 3 gazes, mother to daughter, daughter to stranger, stranger to the void of everything he couldn't guarantee, the decision was made without words. They packed in 40 minutes. 2 suitcases, a box of school supplies, Lena's stuffed rabbit that she tried to hide under her jacket because she was 10 and too old for stuffed animals, and too young to realize that nobody in that room would judge her for needing something soft in a world this hard. Cade and Boone stayed behind after the others escorted Tessa and Lena to the clubhouse. They stood in the empty apartment, listening to the building settle around them. The refrigerator hummed, a faucet dripped. The flowers on the windowsill, white chrysanthemums, Cade noted, the kind sold at every gas station and grocery store, untraceable, sat in a chipped coffee mug Tessa had placed them in before she realized what they meant. "We sleep here," Cade said. "Shifts, 2 men, rotating, lights off, no bikes outside. We make this place look occupied, and we wait." Boone nodded. He walked to the window and looked down at the alley where the ladder had been. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, translucent, a big man made insubstantial by darkness. "How long?" Boone asked. "As long as it takes." "And Nolan?" Cade didn't answer immediately. He picked up one of the chrysanthemums from the mug and turned it between his fingers. The petals were white and perfect and completely ordinary. The kind of flower that means nothing. The kind of flower that, placed on a child's windowsill by an unknown hand in the middle of the night, means everything. "Nolan's one of us," Cade said. "I know he is." "Then that's the answer. That's your answer. The neighborhood has a different one, and sooner or later the neighborhood is going to do something about it." Cade set the flower down. He looked at Boone, his oldest friend, the man who'd held him down on a medevac helicopter while a medic pulled shrapnel from his face, the man who'd driven 800 miles to stand beside him at his divorce hearing without being asked. "Then we better find the real one first." The apartment went dark. 2 men sat in a dead woman's living room, because that's what it was now. A space emptied of life, hollowed out, left as a shell to attract something that moved through the darkness with the patience of a predator who had already proven he could reach a child's window without being seen. Outside, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees. The wind died. Ridgemont went silent. And somewhere in that silence, a phone rang in an apartment on the east side of town. A young man answered. He listened for 12 seconds. Then he smiled, a quick practice smile, the kind that lives on a face built for charm, and said 3 words into the receiver before hanging up. "They moved out." The line went dead. The young man set the phone on his kitchen table, next to a spiral notebook filled with addresses, routines, and names written in neat, careful handwriting. He flipped to a new page. At the top, in block letters, he wrote, "Iron Ravens Clubhouse," and beneath it, in smaller script, 2 words that would change everything. "She's there." The first night in the empty apartment taught Cade something he already knew but had spent years trying to forget, that waiting is the most violent thing a human being can do. Not waiting for something pleasant, waiting for a threat that may or may not materialize, in darkness, in silence, with nothing but your own breathing and the creak of a building settling into cold, and the knowledge that the next sound you hear could be the one that changes everything. He and Boone sat in Tessa's living room with the lights off and the curtains drawn, and 2 chairs pulled to opposite sides of the room so they could cover both the front door and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The apartment smelled like Tessa, coffee grounds and lavender hand lotion, and the faintly chemical sweetness of the industrial cleaner she used on the diner tables. Personal items were still scattered across surfaces she hadn't had time to clear. A hairbrush on the bathroom counter, Lena's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a horse, a house with a chimney, a motorcycle that was surprisingly accurate for a 10-year-old. Cade stared at the motorcycle drawing in the thin gray light leaking through the curtain's edge. A child had drawn that. A child who associated motorcycles with safety. The weight of that sat in his chest like a stone. "Movement," Boone whispered. Cade's hand went to the flashlight beside his chair. Not a weapon. They weren't carrying in a residential building with neighbors on every side, just light, the most basic tool of revelation. Boone was at the window, one finger pulling the curtain back a 1/4 inch. His eye pressed to the gap. His breathing had changed, slower, deeper, the automatic downshift of a body preparing for contact. "Cat," Boone said after 5 seconds. "You sure?" "Orange tabby. Jumped off the dumpster." They settled back. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped. The digital clock on the microwave read 2:47 a.m. in green numerals that were the only light source in the apartment. Nothing came that night, or the next. On the third night, Cade swapped Boone out for Dutch, because Boone's knee was swelling from sitting in cold rooms, and because Dutch had the particular patience of a man who could wait indefinitely without his mind wandering. Cade trusted Dutch the way he trusted a rifle scope, mechanically, completely, without the need for reassurance. They sat in the dark, and they waited, and at 1:15 a.m., Cade's phone vibrated. A text from Reno at the clubhouse. Problem. Come back. He didn't elaborate. Reno never elaborated in text. If it required more than 2 words, he said it face-to-face, which meant this was a face-to-face problem, which meant it was serious. Stay, Cade told Dutch. Call me if anything moves. He rode back to the clubhouse in air so cold the moisture in his nostrils froze with each breath. The streets of Ridgemont were empty, just asphalt and streetlights and the occasional raccoon freezing in its tracks as his headlight swept past. The town felt like a held breath, like something crouching. The clubhouse lights were on. All of them. That was wrong. At 1:30 in the morning, the clubhouse should have been dark except for the bar light and maybe the bathroom. Full illumination meant a gathering. Full illumination at this hour meant a crisis. He parked, killed the engine, sat for 3 seconds in the silence that follows a Harley's last rumble, that particular emptiness where the world rushes back in to fill the space the engine occupied. Then he walked inside. 7 men stood in the main room, not sitting, standing. The body language was wrong. Too much distance between them. Arms crossed. Weight shifted to back feet. The posture of men who have divided into sides without admitting it. Nolan was standing alone by the far wall, next to the jukebox that hadn't worked in 2 years. His face was gray. Not angry, not defensive. Gray. The color of a man who has already been convicted and is waiting for the sentence. Tessa stood near the hallway that led to the back room where she and Lena were staying. Her arms were wrapped around herself and her eyes were red, and she was looking at Nolan with an expression that contained too many things to name. Fear, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of betrayal. What happened? Cade said. Reno stepped forward. He had something in his hand. A phone. Not his. He held it out to Cade the way you hold out evidence, carefully, with significance, with the implicit understanding that what you're about to see will change the trajectory of everything. Tessa found this in the back room, Reno said, under the cot where Lena's been sleeping. Cade took the phone. It was a cheap prepaid model, black, the kind you buy at a gas station for $30. The screen was unlocked. He looked at it. A series of photographs. Tessa's apartment building, shot from different angles, different times of day. The front entrance, the side alley, the fire escape. Lena's bedroom window, photographed from below, the angle slightly upward, the way someone standing in the alley would see it. And the last photo, taken from inside the clubhouse. The back hallway, the door to the room where Tessa and Lena were now sleeping. Cade's blood went cold. Not metaphorically. He felt it. A physical sensation of temperature dropping in his veins, his hands going numb, his vision narrowing to a point. He looked up. Where was this exactly? Under the cot, Tessa said. Her voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a woman holding herself together with wire. Lena dropped her rabbit, and I was reaching under to get it, and I felt it, taped to the bottom of the frame. Cade looked at the phone again, scrolled through the photos, 12 in total. All of Tessa's apartment or the clubhouse. All shot recently. The snow in the backgrounds matched this week's accumulation. All shot by someone who had access to both locations. He looked at Nolan. Every man in the room was already looking at Nolan. Nolan's hands were at his sides. His fingers weren't moving. His chest was barely rising. He looked like a man who has stopped breathing because breathing requires hope, and hope has left the room. That's not my phone, Nolan said. Nobody said it was, Cade replied. Everybody's thinking it. Silence. The space heaters rattled. Outside, the wind pushed against the building with a low moan that sounded almost human. Who else has been in that back room? Cade asked, turning to the group. Tessa and Lena, Reno said. Me, when I helped move the cots in. Dutch, when he brought the extra blankets. Boone stopped by to check on them yesterday afternoon. And Nolan. Nolan was in the room? Cade's voice didn't change, but the question itself was a blade. I brought Lena a sandwich, Nolan said. Yesterday. She was doing homework. I was in there for 2 minutes. 2 minutes is enough time to tape a phone under a cot, Reno said. Nolan's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his left eye. A tiny, involuntary spasm that betrayed the earthquake happening under his stillness. 2 minutes is also enough time to bring a kid a sandwich because she looked hungry. Nobody's arguing about sandwiches, Reno fired back. Then what are you arguing about? I'm arguing about the fact that a phone full of surveillance photos was found in the room where we put a woman and child for protection, and the list of people who've been in that room is short, and your name is on it, and you're the same guy who was driving around that neighborhood in the middle of the night before any of this started. The room compressed. Cade could feel it. The walls closing, the air thickening, the fundamental architecture of the Brotherhood bending under a weight it was never designed to carry. He'd seen units fracture in combat. He'd watched men who would take bullets for each other turn into strangers over a single piece of bad intelligence. It happened fast. It happened quiet. And once it started, it was almost impossible to stop. Reno, Cade said, I'm saying what everybody else is afraid to say. I know what you're saying. I'm telling you to stop. Why? Because it's uncomfortable? Because we don't want to look at our own brother and ask the hard question? Because the hard question is the wrong question. Cade held up the phone. Whoever planted this wanted us to find it. The photos are obvious. The placement is obvious. Taping it under a cot in a room full of people who know Nolan's been visiting, that's not concealment. That's framing. Reno hesitated. The certainty in his face flickered just slightly like a flame touched by a draft. Or, Reno said slowly, it's a guy who got careless. Nolan's a lot of things. Careless isn't one of them. Cade looked around the room. He needed to see their faces. He needed to know where the cracks were before the cracks became chasms. Dutch, steady, watching, withholding judgment. 2 younger members, Fisher and Webb, uncertain, looking to the older men for cues. Boone, absent, still at the apartment, unreachable for the next 4 hours. And Reno, loyal to the club, loyal to the mission, but increasingly convinced that loyalty meant protecting the group from one of its own. Tessa spoke from the hallway. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a siren. I don't care who put it there. I don't care about your Brotherhood politics. There are photographs of my daughter's bedroom window on that phone. My daughter, who is sleeping 20 feet from where we're standing right now. Her voice broke on the last word, and she put her hand over her mouth and held it there until the break sealed. You promised me she would be safe here. She is safe here, Cade said. There's a phone with pictures of her window taped to the bed she's sleeping in. That is not safe. That is the opposite of everything you told me. She was right, and Cade knew she was right. And the knowledge sat in him like acid, dissolving the certainty he'd built this entire operation on. The certainty that moving Tessa and Lena into the clubhouse would put them beyond reach. Instead, it had proven the opposite. Whoever was doing this had reached that extended past locked doors, past a building full of bikers, past every precaution they'd taken. The predator wasn't outside anymore. The predator was close enough to plant evidence inside their fortress. I want to leave, Tessa said. Tonight. Now. Cheyenne. My sister. Tessa, don't tell me it's more dangerous out there. You can't protect her. You proved that. You thought you could and you can't, and I'm not waiting for the next... Mom? The voice came from the hallway behind Tessa, small, sleepy, confused. Lena stood in the doorway of the back room, her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest, her bare feet on the cold concrete floor. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt, one of Dutch's, Cade realized, because nobody had thought to pack pajamas in the rush to leave, and her hair was pressed flat on one side from sleeping. She looked at the room full of men and her mother's tear-streaked face, and she processed all of it in the 3 seconds of silence that followed. Is it the car again? She asked. Nobody answered. It's the car, she confirmed to herself. Then she looked at Nolan, and Nolan looked at her. And what passed between them in that moment was something Cade would remember for years. A child's gaze, direct and uncorrupted, landing on a man the whole room was ready to condemn, and finding nothing there but sadness. "He didn't do it," Lena said. Tessa turned to her. "Baby, go back to bed." "He brought me a sandwich, turkey with extra pickles. He asked me about my homework. He said math was hard, but if I kept trying, I'd get it." She paused. "Bad people don't care about math homework." The room didn't move, didn't breathe. A 10-year-old girl had just delivered a closing argument that none of them could match, and the simplicity of it was devastating. Not because it was evidence, but because it was the kind of truth that only survives in people who haven't yet learned to distrust their own instincts. Cade knelt down. His knees protested. 44 years old, 3 combat tours, a lifetime of motorcycle riding that had compressed every vertebra in his lower spine. He brought himself to Lena's eye level. "Did you see anyone go into your room today? Anyone besides your mom and Nolan?" Lena thought about it. Her brow furrowed. The genuine concentration of a child retrieving a memory, not fabricating one. The man who fixes things came to check the heater. The room shifted. Every head turned. "What man?" Cade asked. "The one who was here when we moved in. He helped us carry stuff. Mom said he was nice. He had a red jacket." Tessa's face changed. The anger drained out of it, replaced by something worse. Recognition. The slow, sickening click of a puzzle piece falling into a place you didn't know existed. "Evan?" Tessa said. Cade stood up. "Who's Evan?" "Evan Morales. He lives on our block. His aunt is Mrs. Delgado. She lives 3 doors down from me. He was helping carry boxes when we arrived at the clubhouse. He said he was just being neighborly. He said his aunt sent him." Reno pulled out his own phone. "Mrs. Delgado. The older woman who organizes the block parties? Who knows everyone?" "She knows everything about everyone," Tessa said. "Every schedule, every routine, who's home, who's traveling, who just had a baby, who works nights. She's the neighborhood. She's been the neighborhood for 30 years. The realization moved through the room like a wave. Not a crash, but a slow rising swell that lifted everything and resettled it in a different configuration. Mrs. Delgado. The beloved gossip. The woman everyone told everything to because telling her felt like telling a friend. And she listened the way a good neighbor listens. With warmth, with interest, with the appearance of care that made every piece of information feel safe in her hands. And every piece of information she gathered flowed to her nephew. Every family routine, every work schedule, every evening someone mentioned they'd be out of town, every confession about being a single mother, about being afraid, about the front door lock that needed replacing. Evan Morales hadn't needed surveillance. He had something better. He had his aunt's living room, where the entire neighborhood laid its secrets bare over coffee and banana bread, never suspecting that the charming young man washing dishes in the next room was listening to every word. "The sedan," Cade said. "Whose car does Mrs. Delgado drive?" Tessa closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were no tears left. Just a cold, flat fury that Cade recognized because it lived in him too. The rage of someone who realizes that the threat was never outside the walls. It was sitting inside them, smiling, handing out cookies, asking how your day was. "Dark blue Buick," Tessa whispered. "She barely drives it, parks it on the street. Lets Evan borrow it whenever he wants." Reno was already moving toward the door. Cade stopped him with a hand on his chest. Not hard, not aggressive, but absolute. "No." "The hell you mean no?" "We don't have proof. We have a theory. We have a child's memory of a man in a red jacket and a name that connects to a car that might be the right color. That's not enough. It's enough for me. It's not enough for what comes after. If we go to his door and we're wrong, we lose everything. If we go to his door and we're right but we handle it wrong, he walks and we catch a case." Reno's chest pressed against Cade's hand. The tension between them was physical. Two men who wanted the same thing disagreeing violently about how to get it. "Then what?" Reno said through his teeth. Cade lowered his hand. He turned to the room. Every face was locked on his, waiting, coiled, vibrating at a frequency that was either disciplined rage or barely contained chaos. These men had spent the last week suspecting their own brother. They had questioned Nolan's character, doubted his midnight drives, measured his grief against the possibility of guilt. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, the entire equation had been rewritten by a 10-year-old girl in an oversized t-shirt holding a stuffed rabbit. Nolan hadn't moved from the wall. His face was still gray, but something had shifted underneath. Not vindication, not relief, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight so heavy that even setting it down hurts. Cade looked at him, held his gaze. And what passed between them was not an apology. Cade didn't apologize with words, and Nolan didn't need him to, but an acknowledgement, a recalibration. The silent, masculine reconfiguration of trust that happens when two men realize they almost broke something irreplaceable, and the almost is the only reason they're still standing in the same room. "Here's what we do," Cade said. "Boone stays at the apartment. The trap stays set. But now we know who we're waiting for. Nolan, Dutch. I want eyes on Evan Morales. Not confrontation, not contact, surveillance. Where he goes, what he drives, who he talks to. Build the pattern. And if he comes to the apartment, then we catch him inside with evidence, with witnesses, and we call the police and let them do what they should have done when Tessa called them the first time." "Since when do we trust the police to handle anything?" Fisher muttered from the corner. "We don't, but we need them for what comes after. We need a record. We need charges. We need this to end with him in handcuffs, not in our hands, because what I want to do to this person—" Cade paused. The scar on his face seemed to deepen in the overhead light, a topographic record of violence he'd both received and was capable of delivering. "What I want to do doesn't help Lena. It doesn't help Tessa. It helps me, and that's not what this is about." The room absorbed this. 8 men processing the discipline required to hold back when every instinct screamed advance. It was the hardest thing Cade had ever asked of them. Harder than the cold nights, harder than the suspicion, harder than the fracture that had nearly split the club apart. He was asking them to be patient in the presence of a predator. And patience in those circumstances is not a virtue, but a violence, a deliberate, sustained act of restraint that costs more than action ever could. "Nolan," Cade said. Nolan looked up. "You ride with me tonight." It was the simplest sentence. 5 words. But in the grammar of the Iron Ravens, where every assignment carried the weight of trust and every pairing was a statement of faith, it was the loudest thing Cade had said all week. Nolan nodded. Once. Lena was still standing in the hallway. Nobody had told her to go back to bed again because the room had forgotten she was there, which was its own kind of testimony. She was so quiet, so still, so practiced at being invisible, that even a room full of men trained to notice threats had lost track of her. She tugged on Tessa's sleeve. "Mom." "Yeah, baby." "He came into the room while I was drawing. The heater man. He said he needed to check the vent behind my bed. He moved the cot." Every man in the room stopped breathing. "He was alone in the room." "For a little bit. I went to get water. When I came back, he said the heater was fine." Cade's hand closed into a fist at his side. Slowly. 1 finger at a time. The knuckles whitened. The tendons stood out against the back of his hand like cables. He unclenched. "Thank you, Lena," he said, and his voice was level, calm, controlled. The voice of a man who has just made a decision that will require everything he has and everything he is and will test the boundary between justice and destruction. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart." Lena went. Her bare feet made almost no sound on the concrete. The stuffed rabbit's ear dragged along the wall behind her, tracing a line in the dust. Tessa watched her go. Then she turned to Cade, and what she said next was not a question. "End this." Cade met her eyes. "Tomorrow night." Outside, the wind had stopped. The parking lot was silent. 8 Harleys sat in a row under a sky so black and starless it looked like the ceiling of a room with no walls. Somewhere across Ridgemont, in a small house on Birchwood Lane, a young man sat at his aunt's kitchen table, eating the leftovers she'd prepared, listening to her talk about the neighbors, who was struggling, who was alone, who had just put new locks on their doors, and filing every word into the architecture of his next move. He didn't know the club had a name for him now. He didn't know that tomorrow night the empty apartment would be waiting and it wouldn't be empty at all. But the club didn't know something either. On his phone, his real phone, not the burner he'd planted, Evan Morales had 17 addresses, 17 homes, 17 families whose routines he'd mapped with the patience of a cartographer charting new territory. Lena and Tessa weren't the first. They were the next. And in a folder on his laptop, hidden beneath 3 layers of encryption, was a list of items taken from each home, not valuable items, not things that would be reported, but personal things. A child's hairbrush, a photograph from a refrigerator door, a single earring from a nightstand. Trophies so small and so intimate that their absence would never be noticed and their presence in his collection would never be explained. The monster wasn't just stalking one family. He was cataloging an entire neighborhood's vulnerability. And tomorrow night, when Cade and his brothers sat in the dark apartment waiting for a burglar, what would walk through that window would be something far worse, something patient, methodical, and intimate in a way that would force every man in the Iron Ravens to confront a darkness they thought they'd left behind in the desert, in the war, in the places where the line between protector and destroyer disappeared completely. They prepared the apartment the way Cade had prepared ambush positions in Helmand, with patience, precision, and the quiet understanding that everything depended on the seconds between contact and control. No room for error, no margin for hesitation, no second chances once the darkness delivered what they were waiting for. Tuesday afternoon, 4 hours before sundown, Cade stood in Tessa's kitchen with a hand-drawn floor plan spread across the counter, sketched on the back of a takeout menu from Patty's Diner, because that was the paper closest to hand when the planning started. The layout was simple: front door, kitchen, living room, hallway, 2 bedrooms, bathroom. 1 window in Lena's room that faced the alley. 1 fire escape accessible from Tessa's room. 2 points of entry for someone who didn't want to use the front door. Boone studied the sketch with his arms crossed. Dutch leaned against the refrigerator. Nolan stood by the sink, running water over his hands, not washing them, just letting the cold run across his knuckles, a habit Cade had noticed he performed whenever his mind was working faster than his body could follow. "He'll use the alley window," Cade said. "Same approach as the flowers. He knows it works. He knows the angle from the dumpster to the ledge. He's done it before." "What if he doesn't come tonight?" Dutch asked. "Then we come back tomorrow night, and the night after, but he'll come tonight." "How do you know?" Cade tapped the floor plan. "The kitchen window, the hallway, the bedroom door. Because he planted that phone yesterday. That means he's accelerating. The photos, the texts, the flowers. Every move has been closer, faster, bolder. He's not building up to something. He's already there. The phone was his way of saying, 'I'm inside.' And once a person like this proves to himself that he can get inside, the next step isn't retreat. It's return." Boone grunted. Agreement, confirmation. The entirety of a tactical briefing compressed into a single syllable. "Positions," Cade continued. "Boone, you're in the living room. Back corner, behind the couch. Dutch, you're in the hallway closet. Door cracked. Sightline to both bedrooms. Nolan, you're with me in Lena's room." He looked at Nolan when he said it, deliberately, publicly, placing Nolan at the exact center of the operation, in the room where the phone was found, where the accusation was born, where the truth would either vindicate or destroy him. It was a statement of trust so loud it didn't need volume. Nolan turned off the faucet, dried his hands on his jeans, nodded. "No lights after 6, Cade said. "No phones, no sound. We breathe quiet. We wait. And when he comes through that window, we let him get both feet on the floor before we move." "Why?" Dutch asked. "Because feet on the floor is intent. Feet on the floor inside a private residence at night is breaking and entering. Feet on the floor with what he's carrying, whatever trophies, whatever tools, is evidence. We need all of it. We need the whole picture. And then? And then we hold him until the police arrive. Reno's on standby 3 blocks away with his phone ready to make the call the second I give the word. The plan was clean. The plan was disciplined. The plan was the product of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that the distance between justice and vengeance is measured in self-control. But plans, Cade knew, survive only until contact. They took their positions at 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes before full dark. The apartment was cold. Cade had turned the heat off to eliminate the sound of the system cycling. December air seeped through the walls and the windows and the gap beneath the front door, settling into the rooms like a living thing. Within an hour, Cade could see his own breath in the faint light from the street lamp filtering through the curtain. Lena's room was small. A single bed. The frame Tessa had pushed against the wall. A dresser with a mirror. A closet with a sliding door. The window faced east, overlooking the alley, and through a crack in the curtain, Cade could see the dumpsters below and the dark mouth of the passage that led to Birchwood Lane. The street lamp at the alley's entrance cast a weak orange cone that reached halfway down the passage and stopped, as if the light itself was afraid to go further. Nolan sat on the floor beside the dresser. Cade sat against the wall opposite the window. They were 4 feet apart in a room that smelled like lavender. Tessa's lotion, Cade realized, embedded in the pillow on the bed. The scent of a mother in a room where she should have been safe. Time moved the way it moves in ambush. Not in minutes, but in textures. The sound of a car passing on the street. The distant bark of a dog. The creak of the building above them, where someone was still awake, walking a floor that groaned with every step. Each sound required analysis, categorization, dismissal. Each silence required the same. At 8:30, Nolan whispered something so quiet Cade almost missed it. "Thank you." Cade didn't respond. Didn't need to. The placement was the thank you. The response was the silence that accepted it. At 9:15, Cade's earpiece, a cheap walkie set to the lowest volume, crackled once. Boon. 1 click. Status check. Cade clicked back. All clear. At 10 o'clock, Dutch clicked. All clear. At 10:47, the dog stopped barking. Cade's body registered it before his mind did. A shift in the ambient soundscape, a subtraction so small that only someone who'd been listening to every noise for 5 hours would notice. The dog that had been barking intermittently from 2 blocks away went silent. Not gradually. Abruptly. Mid-bark. Like someone had pressed mute on the neighborhood. His hand found Nolan's arm in the dark. 2 taps. Attention. Nolan's breathing changed, slower, shallower, ready. 60 seconds passed. 90, 2 minutes. Then Cade heard it. Metal on metal. Faint. The telescoping sections of an aluminum ladder being extended. The sound came from directly below the window. The alley. The exact spot where they'd found the ladder before. The same approach. The same entry point. The muscle memory of a predator returning to a path he'd already proven was safe. Except this time the path led into a room full of men who'd been waiting for him in the dark for 5 hours with nothing to think about except a child's bedroom window and a collection of stolen hairbrushes and photographs. Cade held up a hand. Even in the dark, Nolan could see the gesture. Stay. The discipline required to remain motionless while footsteps climbed toward you was something Cade had learned in combat and never wanted to learn again. Every cell in his body screamed move, intercept, confront. But the plan required patience. The plan required the window. The ladder settled against the brick with a soft thud. Weight transferred onto the bottom rung. A slight groan of aluminum under pressure. Then another rung, another. The climber was moving carefully, testing each step, pausing between rungs to listen for response. He was practiced. He was calm. He had done this before. The curtain moved, not from wind, from proximity. Someone's hand on the exterior of the glass, feeling for the latch. Cade had left it unlocked, deliberately. An invitation disguised as oversight. A click. The latch released. The window slid upward. Cold air flooded the room. Not the stale interior cold they'd been sitting in, but the living, moving cold of a Wyoming December night, carrying the smell of snow and exhaust and the metallic tang of frozen metal. Through the gap between the curtain panels, Cade saw a shape. A silhouette, hands gripping the sill, a leg swinging over, 1 foot on the floor. Wait. The figure paused, half in and half out, listening. The room was silent. The building was silent. Everything was silent except Cade's heart, which was beating so hard he was certain it was audible, certain the intruder could hear it, certain the entire operation was about to collapse because the human body is a traitor that broadcasts fear regardless of training. The second foot came over the sill, both feet on the floor. The figure stood upright, and for 1 second, 1 frozen, airless second, he was silhouetted against the window, a dark shape outlined by the faint orange glow from the distant street lamp. He was young. That was the first thing Cade noticed. Mid-20s, lean, wearing dark clothes and a red windbreaker zipped to the chin. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and his hands were gloved, and his head was covered by a dark beanie pulled low over his ears. He looked ordinary. He looked like someone you'd hold a door open for at the grocery store. He looked like exactly what he was. A monster wearing the most effective disguise in existence. A normal face. Cade hit the flashlight. The beam exploded through the room like a physical force. White light slamming into the intruder's face, blinding him, freezing him in place with his hands still at his sides and his mouth open in a perfect O of shock. The red windbreaker flared bright as arterial blood. His eyes, brown, wide, terrified, reflected the light back at Cade like an animal caught on a highway. "Don't move!" Cade's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. In the confines of that small bedroom, at 2 a.m, after 5 hours of silence, even a whisper would have sounded like a cannon. What Cade delivered was something between a command and a verdict. 2 words that carried the weight of combat authority, of a man who had spent his life in situations where obedience to that voice was the difference between survival and something permanent. The intruder moved anyway. Instinct, panic. The same autonomic response that makes a trapped animal lunge for any gap in the net. He spun toward the window, his hands reaching for the sill, his body already calculating the distance to the ladder, to the alley, to the darkness that had always been his accomplice. Nolan was faster. He came off the floor like something spring-loaded, crossing the 4 feet between the dresser and the window in a motion that was less movement than detonation. His hand closed on the intruder's backpack strap, and he pulled, hard, sudden, irrevocable, and the man came off his feet and hit the bedroom floor with a sound like a bag of sand dropped from waist height. The backpack spilled open. Cade saw it in the flashlight beam. A camera, a small pry bar, a plastic bag containing something he couldn't immediately identify, and a spiral notebook, the same kind sold at every drugstore in America, college-ruled, with a blue cover. "Boone!" Cade called. The hallway light came on. Boone filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the entire opening, and behind him Dutch appeared with a phone already in his hand, the screen illuminating his face from below. The intruder, Evan Morales, though Cade didn't need the confirmation anymore, was on his back on the bedroom floor, breathing hard, his hands raised not in surrender, but in the reflexive gesture of a man trying to make himself smaller. His beanie had come off in the fall, and his hair was dark and disheveled, and his face was the face of someone who had never imagined this moment, who had operated with such careful, practiced invisibility that the concept of being caught existed only as an abstraction. "Please," he said. "I can explain." "You're going to," Cade replied. He knelt beside the spilled backpack, keeping the flashlight on Evan's face. With his other hand, he picked up the plastic bag. Inside were small items, a child's barrette, a photograph, wallet-sized, the kind taken at school picture day, a single sock, small, pink, sized for a child's foot. Cade's hand began to shake, not from fear, not from cold, from the effort required to keep it from becoming a fist. "Reno," he said into the walkie, "make the call." "Copy." "I wasn't going to hurt anyone." Evan's voice was high, rapid, the pitch of a man whose rehearsed explanations are colliding with the reality that no explanation will be sufficient. I needed to see. I wasn't going to." "Stop talking," Boone said from the doorway. He didn't raise his voice. Boone never raised his voice. The volume he used for threats was the same volume he used for ordering coffee, and somehow that made it worse. The casual, unperformative certainty of a man who has decided that the person in front of him has forfeited the right to fill silence with words. Evan stopped talking. Cade opened the spiral notebook. He didn't flip through it. He opened it to the first page and held it in the flashlight beam and read what was written there in neat, careful handwriting that could have belonged to a student or an accountant or anyone whose external order disguised an interior architecture of methodical violation. Addresses. 17 of them. Each one followed by a name, a schedule, a description of the home's layout, and a list of items. Items taken. Items still accessible. Items planned. Tessa Ashcroft's address was number 14. Lena's name was written beside it, followed by her school schedule, her walk-to-school route, and the words second floor window. Easy access, no lock. Cade closed the notebook. He set it on the floor beside the backpack. He stood up, his knees cracked in the silence. He looked down at Evan Morales. This young man with his ordinary face and his aunt who baked banana bread and his childhood spent in a house 3 doors down from the people he was systematically cataloging. And he felt something move through him that was older than anger and colder than rage. It was the recognition of a predator by a protector. The understanding that some dangers don't announce themselves with violence or aggression, but with charm, with normalcy, with the camouflage of being unremarkable in a world that only fears the remarkable. 17 families, Cade said. Evan's eyes darted from Cade to Boone to Dutch, looking for sympathy, looking for the weakest link, finding nothing but walls. My aunt, she doesn't know. She has nothing to do with... I didn't ask about your aunt. I have a problem. I know I have a problem. I'll get help. You broke into a child's bedroom, twice. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Each one created a ripple that expanded through the room, through the men standing in it, through the building, through the night. Nolan was still standing by the window. He hadn't moved since pulling Evan to the floor. His hands were at his sides, and in the harsh overhead light, his face was a study in something Cade had never seen in him before. Not anger, not vindication, but a profound and devastating exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been accused of being a monster and is now standing 3 feet from the real one. 3 weeks, Nolan said quietly. 3 weeks I've been carrying your shadow. 3 weeks the club's been looking at me like I'm the thing they need to protect people from. 3 weeks of my brothers wondering. Evan looked at him, opened his mouth. I don't want to hear it. Nolan's voice didn't rise. It compressed, got smaller and denser and harder. I don't want your explanation. I don't want your story. I want you to know what you did to my family while you were doing what you did to theirs. Sirens. Distant but approaching. The sound entered the room through the open window along with the cold air and the faint smell of snow, and it changed the atmosphere the way a tide changes a beach, not dramatically but completely. Dutch stepped back into the hallway and looked toward the front door. 2 minutes. Cade looked at Boone. A conversation happened in the space between their eyes. They'd had this conversation before, in different rooms, in different countries, standing over different men who had done different terrible things. The conversation was always the same. Do we let the system handle this? Yes, even though the system failed them in the first place. Yes, even though it will probably fail them again. Yes, because the alternative makes us what he is. Blue and red light swept across the curtain, tires on asphalt, car doors opening, boots on the front steps. Cade walked to the front door and opened it. 2 officers stood on the porch with flashlights and hands near their belts, responding to a breaking and entering call from an address they probably recognized. The same address where a woman had called 3 times about a dark sedan and been told to stop watching scary movies. We caught your intruder, Cade said. He's in the back bedroom. He's unarmed. He's not injured. There's a backpack with evidence and a notebook with 17 addresses. The first officer looked past Cade into the apartment. The second officer looked at Cade, at the leather jacket, the scars, the iron raven's patch on his chest, and performed a rapid, visible calculation. Biker, clubhouse. Breaking and entering, his hand moved closer to his belt. Who are you? Cade Mercer. I'm a friend of the family. Friend of the family sitting in a dark apartment in the middle of the night? Yeah, that's how friends work when the police don't. The officer's jaw tightened, but his partner was already moving down the hallway, following Dutch's directions, and within 30 seconds the radio chatter confirmed what Cade already knew. The suspect was in custody, the evidence was visible, and the scope of the situation was larger than a single break-in. They brought Evan Morales out through the front door in handcuffs. The red windbreaker was vivid against the dark uniforms on either side of him, a patch of color in a world of black and blue and gray. He walked with his head down and his shoulders rounded and the posture of collapse, not physical but psychological, the architecture of pretense falling away now that the audience had changed from bikers to badges. Cade stood on the porch and watched. Boone stood beside him. Dutch and Nolan were in the apartment, showing the second officer the backpack, the notebook, the window. 17, Boone said. Cade didn't respond. How long do you think? Years, maybe longer. Boone exhaled. The breath hung in the air, white and heavy. And the aunt? She really didn't know? That's not our problem tonight. Down on the street, more cars were arriving. A detective's unmarked sedan pulled to the curb behind the patrol cars. Lights were coming on in neighboring houses, curtains pulled back, faces appearing in windows, the neighborhood waking to discover that the danger it had been warned about wasn't the leather-clad outsiders who'd been patrolling their streets, but the smiling young man who'd been walking them for years. Reno appeared at the end of the block on foot. He'd parked 3 streets over, as planned. He walked toward the apartment with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face unreadable, and when he reached the porch, he stood in front of Cade and said nothing for a long time. Then he looked toward the apartment door, toward the hallway where Nolan was still standing. I owe him, Reno said. Yeah. I was wrong. Yeah. You gonna make me say it to his face? That's between you and him. Reno nodded. He walked inside. Cade heard the murmur of voices from the hallway. Reno's lower, more careful, stripped of the combative edge that usually defined him, and Nolan's barely audible response. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't try. Some conversations exist only for the people having them, and listening from the outside would diminish what they meant. The detective approached the porch. She was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a heavy coat over a suit that suggested she'd been pulled out of something she'd rather be doing. She had a notebook of her own, a leather-bound one, professional, the kind carried by people who write things down because they matter. Mr. Mercer. Detective. You want to tell me how 4 members of a motorcycle club ended up conducting a stakeout in a civilian residence? I want to tell you that a mother called your department 3 times about a stalker outside her daughter's window. 3 times. The 3rd time, nobody even showed up. The detective's pen stopped moving. She looked at Cade with an expression that was not defensive but also not surrendering. The practiced neutrality of a professional who knows that the criticism is valid but isn't going to acknowledge it on a porch at 2 in the morning. We'll need statements from everyone involved. You'll get them. And the notebook. You opened it? I did. That could be a problem for the chain of evidence. The problem for the chain of evidence is that there are 17 families in that notebook who were never warned, never checked on, never given the basic courtesy of someone giving a damn. The notebook is open. The evidence is there. Whether a biker looked at it first is your department's problem, not mine. The detective held his gaze. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not agreement, not exactly, but the recognition that the man in front of her had done what her department hadn't, and the mathematics of that situation were not in her favor. Stay available, she said. All of you. We're not going anywhere. She walked down the steps. Cade watched her cross the street to her car, open the door, pause, and look back at the apartment building, at the row of motorcycles along the curb, at the lights in the windows where neighbors were standing, watching, beginning the long process of understanding that the world they thought they lived in was not the world they actually lived in. Cade's phone buzzed. A text from Tessa. Is it over? He looked at the screen. 3 words. The weight of a mother's fear compressed into a question so simple it almost didn't need answering. He typed back 2 words. He's caught. 30 seconds later, another text. Can we come home? Cade looked at the apartment. At the open window in Lena's room, where the curtain moved in the wind. At the ladder still leaning against the wall in the alley, tagged now with yellow evidence tape. At the porch where he stood, in the cold, at 3 in the morning, wearing a leather jacket that smelled like exhaust and other people's fear. He typed, Soon. Tomorrow. Let us clean up first. He didn't mean clean the apartment. He meant clean the feeling, the residue of violation, the invisible stain left by someone who had moved through a child's space with intentions that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. He meant making it safe again. Not just physically, not just structurally, but in the way a home needs to feel safe, in its air, in its walls, in the way a child's feet sound on the floor when she runs to the kitchen for a glass of water at midnight without checking behind her. Boone appeared beside him. They stood on the porch together, shoulder to shoulder, watching the blue and red lights paint the snow in alternating colors. The cold was brutal now, deep into single digits, the kind of cold that finds every gap in clothing, every patch of exposed skin, every vulnerability. Neither of them moved to go inside. 17 families, Boone said again. I heard you the first time. Just making sure it lands. It landed. It had been landing since Cade opened that notebook. 17 addresses. 17 blueprints of vulnerability. A catalog of human weakness assembled with the care of an architect and the patience of a collector who was never going to stop because stopping wasn't in the design. Evan Morales hadn't been building toward a single act. He'd been building a system. And systems don't end. They expand. Until someone stands in front of them and says, no. Cade looked down the block. The neighborhood was awake now, fully, irreversibly. People stood on porches in bathrobes and winter coats, holding coffee mugs and phones, talking to each other across the gaps between houses in voices that carried through the cold air with unusual clarity. He could hear fragments. The Delgado boy, motorcycle club, 17, Tessa's daughter. The raw material of a new narrative replacing the old one. The story of the neighborhood was being rewritten in real time, and for the first time, the bikers in that story were not the villains. They were the reason the story had an ending at all. Nolan walked out onto the porch. He stood on Cade's other side. 3 men in a row, breath steaming, leather creaking in the cold. He didn't say anything. He pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket, lit it, and smoked it slowly while the lights flashed and the radios crackled and the night began its long, slow turn toward morning. Cade looked at him. You good? Nolan took a drag, held it, let it out in a stream of white that the wind carried away instantly. No, he said, but I'm here. Cade nodded. That was enough. Being here. Being present at the moment when the fracture healed and the brotherhood proved itself and the verdict came in, not from a court, but from the men who'd doubted, and the man who'd endured the doubt, and the child who'd looked across a room full of suspicion and said he didn't do it with the certainty of someone who still trusted her own eyes. Down the street, a squad car pulled away with Evan Morales in the back seat. The red windbreaker was the last thing visible through the rear window. A shrinking point of color swallowed by the night, carried away from the neighborhood he'd mapped, and the families he'd cataloged, and the child whose window he would never climb through again. The car turned the corner and disappeared. The neighborhood exhaled. And in the silence that followed, the first real silence in weeks, unburdened by surveillance or suspicion or the weight of an unnamed threat, the distant sound of a Harley engine starting carried across the rooftops like a heartbeat returning to a chest that had forgotten how to beat. The days after Evan Morales' arrest moved through Ridgemont like a slow thaw. Not the dramatic kind, not a sudden warming that melts everything at once, but the incremental, almost invisible shift that happens when something frozen begins to remember it was once liquid. The process was painful. Thawing always is. Because before things get better, they get messy. And messy in a neighborhood that had just discovered its most trusted information network was the source of its greatest violation, meant conversations that nobody wanted to have and truths that nobody wanted to hold. Mrs. Delgado learned on a Wednesday morning. 2 detectives arrived at her door at 9 o'clock with the kind of gentle professionalism that is reserved for delivering news that will dismantle a person's understanding of their own life. Cade heard about it later from Tessa, who heard it from a neighbor, who heard the old woman's voice through the shared wall of her duplex. Not screaming, not wailing, but a sound worse than both. A low continuous moan, the sound of a foundation cracking, the sound of a woman realizing that the nephew she'd raised since he was 14, the boy she'd fed and clothed and bragged about at block parties, had been using her kitchen table as an operations center and her living room conversations as intelligence briefings for years. She didn't leave her house for 4 days. The dark blue Buick, the sedan that had sat outside Tessa's apartment in the small hours, the shape that had terrified Lena enough to walk into a biker clubhouse, sat untouched at the curb, collecting snow, becoming less of a car and more of a monument to the distance between what a thing is and what a thing is used for. Cade didn't visit Mrs. Delgado. It wasn't his place. The damage Evan had done existed in concentric circles, the innermost ring belonging to the 17 families he'd cataloged, The next ring belonging to Mrs. Delgado and the network of trust he'd corrupted, and the outermost ring belonging to the neighborhood itself, which now had to reckon with the fact that its social fabric had been weaponized by someone who smelled like banana bread and knew everyone's birthday. The Iron Raven's role in that reckoning was complicated. For the first week after the arrest, the club existed in a strange liminal space, celebrated by some, distrusted by others, and discussed by everyone. The local newspaper ran a story that mentioned them once, obliquely, as a local motorcycle organization that assisted in the suspect's apprehension. Cade read the article in the clubhouse with a cup of coffee that was, for once, still warm. Motorcycle organization, Dutch said, reading over his shoulder. That's generous. It's accurate. It's the first time anyone's called us an organization instead of a gang. Cade set the paper down. He didn't care about labels. He had never cared about labels. The patch on his jacket said Iron Ravens, and beneath that it said Ridgemont, and beneath that it said nothing at all because the things that mattered about the club, the loyalty, the damage, the brotherhood forged in places where brotherhood was the only thing between you and the void, couldn't be printed on leather. They lived in the space between men, in the silences, in the nods, in the way Boone had stood beside him on that porch at 3 a.m. and said 17 families twice because once wasn't enough to carry the weight. The detective, her name was Harlan, Karen Harlan, came to the clubhouse on Thursday to take final statements. She arrived in her unmarked sedan parked between two Harleys that dwarfed it and walked inside with the careful neutrality of a law enforcement professional entering a space she would have avoided a week ago. She set a digital recorder on the bar and interviewed each member individually while the others waited in the garage, smoking, not talking. When it was Nolan's turn, Cade stayed in the room. He didn't ask permission. He pulled a stool to the end of the bar and sat there with his coffee and his silence, and Detective Harlan looked at him and decided not to make it an issue. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "can you walk me through the events of the night in question?" Nolan walked her through. His voice was flat, factual, drained of everything that had made those hours so excruciating. He described the positions, the waiting, the sound of the ladder, the window, the flashlight, the backpack. He did not describe what it felt like to be the man the club suspected. He did not describe the text messages. He did not describe the 3 weeks of driving through empty streets at 2 a.m. because his apartment felt like a coffin, and movement was the only alternative to something darker. Those things were not for a police recorder. Those things lived in the space between brothers, and that space was not public. When the interview ended, Detective Harlan turned off the recorder and sat for a moment, looking at her notes. Then she looked at Cade. "The notebook," she said. 17 addresses. We've made contact with all of them. Most didn't even know anything was missing. A hairbrush here, a photograph there. Things small enough that their absence was attributed to misplacement. Cade said nothing. "If you hadn't caught him, we wouldn't have. Not for a long time, maybe not until—" She stopped. The sentence had a destination that neither of them wanted to visit. "The department is going to take some heat for the missed calls. Tessa Ashcroft's reports, the ones that weren't followed up on. They should. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not asking you to." She closed her notebook, stood up, looked around the clubhouse, at the scarred bar, the dead jukebox, the space heaters, the motorcycle parts on shelves, the photographs on the wall of men in leather standing beside machines that most of the world considered threatening, and these men considered essential. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you did matters." Cade nodded. He didn't thank her. Gratitude from law enforcement was a currency he'd stopped trying to earn decades ago, not because it was worthless, but because earning it required performing for an audience that hadn't shown up when the performance actually mattered. The time for the department to matter was when Tessa called. The time for acknowledgement was now, and now was too late to be anything more than a footnote. Harlan left. The unmarked sedan pulled out of the parking lot, and Cade watched it go from the window behind the bar, holding his coffee, standing in the exact spot where he'd been standing the afternoon Lena walked in. Tessa and Lena moved back into the apartment on Friday. Cade and Boone and Dutch spent Thursday cleaning it. Not the police tape kind of cleaning, which had already been done, but the real kind. The kind that involves scrubbing floors and washing windows and replacing the curtain in Lena's room because the old one had been touched by hands that had no right to touch anything in that space. Dutch installed a new lock on the window, a deadbolt, heavy duty, the kind that requires a key from both sides. Boone replaced the latch on the front door. Cade repainted Lena's windowsill because the evidence technicians had left fingerprint powder in the cracks, and he didn't want her to see it. He was on his knees with a paintbrush when Tessa arrived. She stood in the bedroom doorway with a paper bag of groceries in one arm and watched him paint with slow, careful strokes, covering the gray residue with white, erasing the physical evidence of violation the way no one could erase the psychological kind. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." "Cade." He looked up. She was leaning against the doorframe. That gesture again, the one she'd used the first night, gripping the wood for balance. But this time the grip was different, less desperate, more grounded. The hold of someone who is standing in her own doorway because it is her doorway and she has decided to stay. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, 2 syllables. But the way she said them, with the full weight of 3 weeks of terror and displacement and the particular exhaustion of a single mother who has been running for so long that standing still feels like a radical act, transformed them into something larger than gratitude. It was acknowledgement, recognition. The admission that a stranger had done for her what the entire structure of civil society had failed to do, and the cost of that admission was the abandonment of the belief that the system would ever be enough. Cade stood up. His knees protested. Paint was drying on his fingers. "She's safe," he said. "That's the part that matters." "Is she? Really?" He understood the question. Not is she safe right now, in this moment, with locks on the windows and bikers on the street, but is she safe in the way a child needs to be safe? Fundamentally, permanently, in the architecture of her understanding of the world. Because Lena had learned something in the past 3 weeks that couldn't be unlearned. She had learned that danger wears a normal face, that the person at your door might be cataloging your vulnerabilities while smiling, that the system designed to protect you will tell you to stop watching scary movies while the monster climbs your window. "She's 10, Cade said. "She's going to carry this. But she's also going to carry the fact that she walked into a room full of strangers and asked for help, and it worked. She's going to remember that part too." Tessa's eyes filled. She blinked twice. Hard, the way people do when crying is not an option, but the alternative, the dry, compressed alternative of holding everything inside, has become physically impossible. "She drew you," Tessa said. "What?" "On the refrigerator, the motorcycle drawing, the one that was there when you were staying here. She drew it the day after she came to the clubhouse. She told me it was a picture of the man who listens." Cade looked at the refrigerator, visible through the bedroom door. The drawings were still there. Tessa hadn't taken them down during the move. The horse, the house, the motorcycle. He'd seen the motorcycle drawing during the stakeout and thought a child had drawn a machine. She'd drawn a person. He turned back to the windowsill and picked up his paintbrush because if he kept looking at that refrigerator, he was going to feel something he'd spent 20 years keeping in a box labeled Kandahar. And opening that box required more courage than catching a predator in a dark room. And he wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the box moved. Just slightly. A shift in weight he felt behind his sternum. The lid didn't open, but it loosened. That evening, the club gathered at the clubhouse. Not for a meeting, not for business. Just for the gathering itself. The simple act of being in the same room, occupying the same air, sharing the same silence that had nearly been destroyed by 3 weeks of suspicion and fracture, and the particular poison of doubt that eats brotherhood from the inside. 8 men. The same 8 who had sat around the table when Cade first proposed the surveillance. The same 8 who had stood in the main room at 1 in the morning while a planted phone threatened to tear them apart. But different now. Changed in ways that weren't visible but were permanent. The way a bone that breaks and heals is never the same bone. It's stronger at the fracture point, denser, rebuilt with the body's grudging acknowledgement that this spot requires reinforcement. Reno stood at the bar pouring whiskey into mismatched glasses. He poured 8. He carried one across the room to Nolan, who was sitting in the chair by the dead jukebox, the same spot he'd occupied the night of the accusation, as if returning to the scene of the wound was part of healing it. "Here," Reno said. Nolan took the glass, looked at it, looked at Reno. "I was wrong," Reno said. "I was wrong, and I said things in front of the club that I shouldn't have said, and I don't have an excuse. You were protecting the club. I was afraid. There's a difference." Nolan held the glass for a moment. The whiskey caught the overhead light and glowed amber, warm, the color of something that burns going down and spreads warmth after the burning stops. He raised the glass. Reno raised his. They drank simultaneously, and the gesture was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but it was continuation. The decision to keep going in the same direction despite the damage, the choice to remain brothers in a world that had given them every reason not to be. Cade watched from the bar. He was doing what he always did, observing, measuring, cataloging the emotional architecture of his club, the way a structural engineer assesses a building after a quake, looking for weaknesses. Finding, instead, the places where the stress had revealed strength that wasn't visible before the test. Boone settled onto the stool beside him. The big man moved carefully. His knee was still swollen, the legacy of too many cold nights in a chair that wasn't designed for a man his size. He had a glass of whiskey in one hand and a phone in the other. "News alert," Boone said. "DA's office is filing charges tomorrow. Multiple counts. The notebook's admissible." "Good." "They're also opening an internal review into the department's handling of Tessa's calls." "Better." Boone put the phone away. He drank. He set the glass down with the particular gentleness of a large man who has learned that everything he touches requires calibration. "You ever think about what would have happened if Lena hadn't walked through that door?" Boone asked. Cade had thought about it. Every night since. The alternative history played out in his mind with the clarity of a combat scenario. Lena continuing to walk past the clubhouse on her way to school, looking at the Harleys, wondering, but never stopping. The sedan continuing to appear. The phone calls continuing to go unanswered. Evan Morales continuing to refine his system, adding addresses, collecting trophies, climbing windows in the dark while the neighborhood slept, and the police filed reports that nobody read. The alternative history ended in a place Cade refused to visit. He stopped the scenario before it reached its conclusion every time, the way you stop a falling object before it hits the ground. Not because you can actually stop it, but because imagining the impact requires a cruelty toward reality that he wasn't willing to exercise. "She did walk through that door," Cade said. "That's the only version that matters." "But why us? Why here?" "Because she saw us. Because we were visible. Because we were the thing the neighborhood was afraid of, and she was more afraid of everything else." Boone considered this. So being frightening saved her. Being present saved her. Being frightening just meant nobody argued with us while we did it. At 8 o'clock, the door opened. Tessa stood in the entrance, snow in her hair, Lena beside her. The girl was wearing a new coat, puffy, blue, the kind of aggressively cheerful winter gear that mothers buy as an act of optimism against the cold. And she was carrying a plate covered in aluminum foil. "We brought cookies," Lena announced. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance, as if the act of bringing cookies to a room full of bikers was the most natural thing in the world. She walked to the bar, set the plate down, and peeled back the foil to reveal chocolate chip cookies that were slightly burned on the edges and slightly underdone in the centers, and absolutely, unmistakably homemade. "I made them," she said. "Mom helped with the oven part." Dutch took one, bit into it, chewed with the solemn concentration of a man evaluating something important. "Best cookie I've ever had," he said. "You're lying." "Maybe, but I'm eating it, so does it matter?" Lena grinned. The grin transformed her face, erased the premature age from her eyes, the caution from her posture. The 10-year-old's approximation of adult wariness that she'd been wearing like armor since the first night she walked through that door. For 3 seconds, she was just a kid who baked cookies and brought them to people she wasn't afraid of anymore. Nolan took a cookie from the plate. Lena watched him. "Extra pickles next time," she said. He looked at her. The reference landed. The turkey sandwich, the homework, The math being hard but worth trying. The moment in the back room when he'd been a stranger bringing food to a frightened child, and she'd been a child deciding whether strangers could be trusted. That moment had become evidence, not legal evidence, the kind of evidence that exists between people who have shared something that neither of them fully understood at the time, but both of them would remember. Deal, Nolan said. Tessa stood near the door, watching. She hadn't come further into the room, maintaining the slight distance of a woman who is grateful but still recalibrating, still adjusting the boundary between the life she'd had before and the life she was building now. Cade noticed. He walked to her carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. "You didn't have to bring her here tonight," he said. "She wanted to come. She's been talking about it all day. She wanted to bring cookies to her bikers." Her bikers. That's what she calls you, all of you. My bikers, as in, "Mom, my bikers caught the bad guy," as in, "Mom, can we go see my bikers this weekend?" Cade looked at the room, at Lena distributing cookies with the authority of a hostess at a party she was running, at Dutch and Fisher and Webb eating them with exaggerated enthusiasm, at Boone, who was holding a cookie in his enormous hand with the delicacy of a man handling a live grenade, examining it like it contained classified intelligence, at Nolan, who was sitting with his back against the wall and a cookie in his hand and the first genuine expression of peace Cade had seen on his face in a month. "She can come whenever she wants," Cade said. Tessa sipped the coffee. Her eyes moved to Nolan, stayed there. "He's different since this ended," she said. "Quieter, but not the bad kind of quiet. More like the kind of quiet where someone's actually sleeping at night." Cade didn't comment. He'd noticed it too. The change in Nolan that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with the slow, grinding process of a man who'd been drowning, discovering that the water had receded enough to breathe. The breakup with Sarah was still there. The loneliness was still there. But something had been added, not subtracted, added to the equation. A child who believed in him when the room didn't. A plate of cookies delivered to a jukebox that hadn't worked in 2 years. The small, accumulated evidence that the world, for all its cruelty, still contained people who looked at you and saw something worth feeding. "He'll be okay," Cade said. "You sure?" "No, but he's got time, and he's got us." Tessa looked at him, really looked. The way she hadn't been able to that first night on the porch, when every man was a threat and every offer of help was a transaction. Now she looked at him the way you look at a wall that has held, not with admiration, not with romance, but with the profound, exhausted recognition that some structures are exactly what they appear to be, and trusting them is not naive but necessary. "Thank you," she said again, but differently this time. Lighter, less like a debt and more like a fact. "The sky is blue, the coffee is hot. Thank you." He nodded, drank his coffee, watched the room. At 9 o'clock, Tessa took Lena home. The girl hugged Dutch on the way out, threw her arms around his midsection, and squeezed with the full-body commitment of a child who has decided that this person is safe. Dutch stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his face displaying a complex emotion that involved surprise and discomfort, and something gentler that he would deny if anyone mentioned it. Lena released him, looked up. "You can keep the plate," she said. "I know where you live." She walked out. Tessa followed. The door closed. The clubhouse was quieter without them, but the quiet was different now. Not the heavy, suspicious silence of 3 weeks ago, but the comfortable, breathing silence of a space that has been temporarily filled with something warm and is holding the impression of it the way a cushion holds the shape of a body after the body stands up. Cade stood at the window behind the bar. His position, his vantage point. The parking lot was dark except for the light above the door, which cast a yellow cone across the first row of motorcycles. Beyond that, Birchwood Lane stretched toward the center of town. Streetlights, houses, the distant neon of the diner, the silhouette of mountains against a sky that was, for the first time in weeks, showing stars. He watched Tessa's car pull away, watched the taillights shrink and turn and disappear, watched the street go empty and still. Behind him, the club was settling, glasses being washed, chairs being pushed back, the sounds of men moving through a space they'd earned the right to call home. Not through ownership, not through mortgage or deed, but through the accumulation of hours spent together in cold rooms and dark apartments, and the particular shared misery of caring about people who weren't required to care about them back. Nolan appeared beside him. Cade hadn't heard him approach, which was unusual. He heard everything, a byproduct of years spent in environments where not hearing something could be fatal. But Nolan moved quietly, and the clubhouse was loud enough with the hum of the refrigerator and the rattle of the space heaters to cover his footsteps. They stood at the window together, two men who had been to war and come home to a different kind of war and found, in the space between the two, a brotherhood that served as both fortress and family. "She said I should come by the diner sometime," Nolan said. "Tessa?" "Said she'd save me the corner booth, the one by the window." He paused. "Said Lena likes to do her homework there, after school." Cade looked at him. Nolan was staring at the parking lot, but his eyes were focused on something further away, a point in the middle distance where the present meets the possibility of a future that isn't defined by loss. "You going to go?" "Thinking about it." "Don't think about it, just go." Nolan almost smiled. The almost was enough. One by one, the brothers left. Engines started in the parking lot, each one distinct, each one carrying its particular note in the chorus of a club that had been tested and fractured and rebuilt in the span of 3 weeks. Boone's deep, rumbling V-twin. Dutch's slightly rough idle that he kept promising to fix, Fisher's clean high note, Webb's throaty exhaust, Reno's unmistakable downshift at the parking lot exit. The only man who shifted gears before he reached the road, a habit so consistent it functioned as a signature. Cade listened to them go. Each engine starting was a departure. Each departure was a confirmation. I'm here, I'm riding, I'll be back tomorrow. The clubhouse emptied. The lights went off one by one. The space heaters continued their futile rattle against the December cold. The coffee pot sat on the burner with an inch of liquid at the bottom, slowly reducing to a film that would be there in the morning when someone, probably Cade, arrived before anyone else and made a fresh pot and stood at the window and watched the parking lot and waited for the day to bring whatever it was going to bring. He put on his jacket. The leather was cold and stiff and smelled like it always smelled. Exhaust, coffee, the ghost of 1,000 rides and 100 nights, and the accumulated residue of a life spent in motion, because motion was the only alternative to the stillness that lived inside him, the quiet center where everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to save and everything he'd never be weighted with patient, permanent residence. He zipped the jacket, killed the last light, walked outside. The cold hit him. Single digits. The kind of cold that erases thought and reduces existence to sensation. Air in the lungs, boots on concrete, leather against skin. He crossed the parking lot to his bike. The Harley sat in the yellow cone of the doorlight, chrome catching the glow, exhaust pipes silver with frost. He didn't start it immediately. He stood beside it, one hand on the handlebar, and looked east toward Birchwood Lane. He couldn't see the street from here. It was 6 blocks away, hidden behind houses and trees and the accumulated geography of a town that was small enough to be a neighborhood and large enough to hide a predator for years. But he could feel it. The way a soldier feels a perimeter he's walked enough times to navigate blind. The street was out there. The apartment was out there. Lena was out there, in her bedroom with the new lock on the window and the fresh paint on the sill, sleeping the way a child should sleep, deeply, completely, without checking behind the curtain at 2 a.m. He'd made that possible. Not alone. Not without cost. But possible. Cade started the engine. The Harley coughed once, caught, and settled into its idle. Low, steady, the mechanical heartbeat that had been the most constant sound in his life for 20 years. He sat for a moment, letting the engine warm, feeling the vibration move through the frame and into his body and become indistinguishable from his own pulse. Then he rode. Not home. He didn't go home first. He took the long way, the route that wound through the center of Ridgemont, past the diner where Tessa's shift would start in 7 hours, and the school where Lena would walk tomorrow morning, and the block where Mrs. Delgado's Buick sat under a blanket of snow that nobody would disturb. He rode slowly, not patrolling, not surveilling, just moving through the town the way blood moves through a body. Present, necessary, quiet. The streets were empty. The stars were out. The cold was enormous, and somewhere in the dark behind him, the clubhouse door stayed unlocked, the way it always did. Because in a town full of locked windows and unanswered calls, and the slow erosion of the belief that someone will come when you need them, one door staying open was enough. Some families are born into blood and bone and the accident of proximity. Others are built in cold rooms by damaged men who never learned to say what they meant, but learned, eventually, to show it. With a paintbrush on a child's windowsill, with a turkey sandwich delivered without being asked, with a row of motorcycles on a frozen street standing watch over people who had no one else. Lena Ashcroft was 10 years old the night she walked into the Iron Ravens clubhouse carrying a faded purple backpack and 5 words that changed everything. She was still 10 when she walked back in 3 weeks later, carrying a plate of burned cookies and a new word for the men who'd answered. Family. Not the kind you're given. The kind that arrives when everything else has failed, wearing leather and engine grease and the quiet, unshakable certainty that some doors are meant to stay open, especially in winter, especially in the dark.